So without further ado, I'm pleased to present this week's speaker, Professor Laura Martin, Associate Professor of Environmental Studies and Faculty Affiliate in History. Laura earned her undergraduate degree in biophysics at Brown University, followed by a master's and PhD in natural resources at Cornell University. Before she joined Williams in 2017, she was a ZIF Environmental Fellow at Harvard. Her interdisciplinary work incorporates insights from both ecology and history as she looks at how human decisions and environmental management affect the habitats of other species. Her most recent book is titled Wild by Design, The Rise of Ecological Restoration, and I believe we will be hearing some of these insights in her talk today, Wild by Design, From Bombs to Biodiversity. Please join me in welcoming Laura Martin.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you to Liz and Anne, Michael and Carrie for the invitation. And thank you to all of you for coming today to a basement when it is uncannily beautiful and uncannily warm outside. I appreciate it, and it's nice to see familiar faces. So today I'm going to connect the dots between bombs and biodiversity, two things that might not be obviously apparent what the connection is. And I'll contend that the very idea of biodiversity emerged through American nuclear colonialism and biological weapons. But first, a little bit of context about biodiversity and kind of my career trajectory. So the question of how to restore biodiversity is one of the most pressing of our century. Species are struggling, confronted with climate change, with persistent pollution, with habitat fragmentation. And there's currently more than 42,000 animal and plant species that are threatened with extinction, according to the IUCN. UNEP, the UN Environmental Program, puts that number even higher, closer to 1 million species. And this is just extinction is just one metric of thinking about how species are doing. The number of individuals within many species is also declining rapidly. So one recent paper estimates that humans have decreased the total mass of wild mammals on Earth by 85%. So by all metrics, biodiversity is declining. This alarming decline is despite the fact that since the 1970s, the number of protected areas for biodiversity globally has increased exponentially. So there's now more than 270,000 protected areas worldwide that cover nearly 16% of land and 8% of marine area. You can see this in bright green and bright blue on the map. But biodiversity is continuing to decline. Nevertheless, many conservationists are now doubling down on preservation. The late biologist E.O. Wilson proposed in his 2017 book, Half Earth, that conservationists should set aside half of the Earth for biodiversity protection. And this plan has been endorsed by a broad coalition of environmental organizations. The kind of 2019 Global Deal for Nature, motivated by this book, argues for 30% of the world's surface to be put under some form of protection by 2050. So troublingly, these proposals neglect to specify where exactly this protection would occur. One recent paper by a sociologist estimates that the Half Earth Plan, if implemented, would displace about 1 billion people from their homes, people that would find themselves to be conservation refugees, as so many people around the world already have, who have been forcibly displaced from their home and homelands in the name, under the auspices of biodiversity protection. So rather than enforce a separation between humans and nature, between humans and other species, my work seeks to promote conservation in the places where people already live and work. So preservation, I'm, as you can see, I'm against preservation as the sole or only strategy for biodiversity. Conservation, I believe it's defeatist. I believe that it assumes that rapacious capitalism, that environmental destruction is inevitable, rather than a recent phenomenon that is caused by a particular small subset of people with extreme power and wealth. So, as Anne mentioned, I was a scientist before I was a historian. And my research agenda at the broadest scale is seeking to bring the sciences and the humanities together to understand how people create habitat for other species, sometimes intentionally and sometimes unintentionally. So today I'm going to briefly explain how I arrived at my 2022 book, Wild by Design, The Rise of Ecological Restoration, and then I'll describe my current research, which is a book project tentatively titled The War Against Weeds, How Hormonal Herbicides Reshaped Life on Earth. So I began my career as a field ecologist, working on rapid evolution in plants. My field sites sometimes were as attractive as this site, but much more often they looked like this. This is a roadside ditch outside of Albany, New York on I-90, and it's overtaken by a non-native grass, Phragmites australis. As an ecologist, I was struck by, it's not surprising, but I was struck by how few of my colleagues were working in places like this. And to be honest, kind of envious of their field sites, which were much more beautiful than I-90. So I found, I just didn't know many people in my field that were working in roadside ditches or agricultural fields. And this was around the time that environmental studies scholars in the humanities were starting to critique the idea of pristine wilderness, and that environmentalists in the United States were so focused on wilderness areas. So I decided to quantify my hunch that ecologists were working in wilderness areas to the exclusion of working landscapes. And this was my first foray into science and technology studies, which is a broad interdisciplinary field that attempts to understand science and its consequences in historical and political context. So to analyze the geographical distribution of ecological study sites globally, I reviewed more than 8,000 papers published in 10 top ecology journals. Unfortunately, this was before robust machine learning, and I did this by hand. I would not today have to do this by hand, but the library at Cornell shut down my account because they thought I was harvesting PDFs because I was going through so many so quickly. I found that 63% of ecological studies were conducted in protected areas, even though at the time only 12% of Earth's ice-free land was under protection. So there was a mismatch there. And I found also that less than 4% of ecological studies were conducted in densely settled areas. Ecological studies were over-selecting, as I said, protected areas. They were also over-selecting temperate deciduous woodlands and, unsurprisingly, wealthy countries. So ecologists, in other words, were studying protected or uninhabited areas at a time when one of our most pressing global questions was and is how to manage biotic communities and the places where people live and work. So I soon began noticing other ways in which social norms influence the doing of ecological science. In 2015, I led an interdisciplinary team that coined the term indoor biome. And this is to describe the ecological realm of species that reside or reproduce in human-built structures. The indoors is a massively understudied area in ecology. Ecologists, if you think about them, like they study the outdoors. But this is a problem because if you think about Manhattan, which this graphic on the left is demonstrating, if you add up the indoor area in Manhattan, it's 3 times larger than the outdoor area in Manhattan. Our team found that the indoor biome globally is substantial and it's expanding rapidly. It's on the same size as other small biomes like flooded grasslands and tropical coniferous forests. And right now, the indoor biome kind of spans an area larger than France, and it's growing. So the indoor biome remains at science's frontier. We know virtually nothing about it. There's been just a few papers trying to quantify which species are indoors and why. There's some species that we have no idea how they evolved to be only indoor species of cockroach, right? Like there's all sorts of really interesting questions there. So our paper kind of opened up a new field of biodiversity science, and it's also been influential in architecture and public health. If you think about the implications for hospitals and what lives inside of hospitals as one example. So our indoor biome paper showed that people are unintentionally or unthinkingly creating habitat for species all the time, as anyone who's had a bed bug infestation is very aware. But people also intentionally create habitat and intentionally care for other species. And indeed, maintaining wild spaces and species increasingly involves active human interventions. And I'm interested in these types of interventions. So we see in the upper left photo a sniper that is shooting non-native goats on Isla Isabela in the Galapagos. In the bottom left, we see volunteers with the International Crane Foundation teaching a baby whooping crane how to follow a flock in hopes that it will migrate with that flock. So people even standing in as the surrogate parents of other organisms. In the upper right, a forester is conducting a prescribed burn in longleaf savanna in the American Southwest. And then perhaps the example that most people are most familiar with when thinking about these sort of restoration activities, the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone National Park, which began in the 1990s. So I was interested in understanding the regulations, politics, and history of these sorts of interventions. And to do so, I needed to turn to the tools of environmental history. So in my book, Wild by Design, I analyzed the history of ecological restoration as a scientific practice, but also as an idea and a regulatory framework, primarily in the United States. So as the title indicates, the book explores the tensions between wildness and design, between the desire to see other species have autonomy and a desire to control and manipulate what species are in our environments. And in the eyes of many Western environmentalists, human presence and even acts of human care diminish the wildness of species, and wildness is a thing that many people care about when thinking about the value of species. And I argue that this is why hands-off preservation, the kind of protected areas that I started with, are appealing to so many people. But in an age of habitat destruction and climate change, many wild species are not going to survive without active, ongoing intervention and care. And ecological restoration as a practice kind of confounds the seeming contradiction between wildness and design, because restorationists are attempting to do both. So in Wild by Design, I define restoration as an attempt to collaborate with other species to co-design nature. And this definition is a bit different than the Society for Ecological Restoration, the kind of international scientific society's definition. Their definition is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. I mean, I can talk about in the Q&A why I chose, I believe in the word design here as opposed to the verb to assist. Again, for reasons I can go into later. But restoration projects like this one, where summer campers are planting sweet gum seedlings at the New York Botanical Garden, are increasingly at the center of international environmental negotiation. Last year, the UN Biodiversity Conference approved the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which promotes restoration as one of a number of actions for biodiversity. And just last year, this November, European lawmakers passed a restoration bill that's going to require EU countries to restore 20% of nature within their borders. So we see this governments are now implementing restoration plans. Ireland's was just announced released 2 days ago. And today, governments, nonprofits, private corporations, as well as philanthropic entities are now spending billions of dollars per year on things like planting trees specifically for carbon sequestration, invasive species removal, wetlands creation, and these other things that fall under the category of restoration. So the time's right to think about how restoration can help to address the twinned biodiversity crisis and climate crisis. And this is where the history of restoration can really guide us. So there's one archive of restoration. As I mentioned, like many different entities do restoration. So in writing Wild by Design, I brought together archives that are rarely studied in concert, including those of the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Nature Conservancy, and the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission. And I think that's the one that kind of surprises audiences when I talk about it. And that's where I'm going to get to the bomb piece. But the book begins with the founding of the Wildflower Preservation Society of America in 1902, and it ends with recent efforts to use CRISPR genome editing technology to do things like create ecotypes of coral that are better able to survive in acidic or warmer waters. Over the course of this timeline, we see a gradual shift from single species restoration to ecosystem restoration, and from kind of a diffuse volunteer-based effort to restoration efforts that are increasingly consolidated and privatized. In part one of the book, I argue that restoration first emerged as an explicit alternative to both wilderness preservation as well as progressive era conservation. And these are two other movements that historians have given much more attention to. So kind of the one overarching goal of the book was just to say, like, there's this other movement that matters and is continuing increasingly to matter more and more on the international stage every year. The game restoration movement preceded the emergence of ecology as a scientific discipline. And this was a movement that began in the early 1900s when conservationists who did not want to see further gun restrictions or hunting restrictions argued that big game could be bred and then by the federal government and then released onto designated reservations. And this bison restoration is often celebrated kind of internationally as a restoration success story. The numbers of bison in North America went from around, there's controversy about the number, but around 30 million to a low of 325 in 1884, and this was because of the systematic eradication of bison by white settler colonists. Bison numbers are around 500,000 today. So this has been a story of restoration success. Bison are no longer an imminent risk of extinction. But in Wild by Design, I show that the habitats that were first remade for bison restoration were established on Indian reservations that the federal government was systematically dismantling under the Dawes Act in order to erode tribal sovereignty. So the first bison restoration, these bison restoration sites became the first sites in what is now the US National Wildlife Refuge System. And this is a story that hasn't really been told. It's been the national park piece of it has been told. There's a lot of recent scholarship about how the establishment of U.S. national parks was required or was founded upon the dispossession of Native American lands and nations. But this tells a kind of similar story for the Fish and Wildlife Service and for wildlife refuges. So, like bison eradication, I argue that bison restoration also depended upon the ideology and also the kind of administrative apparatus of settler colonialism. And I next in the book show how the idea and the practice of ecological restoration emerged as distinct from game restoration. And this emerged in the 1930s from ecologists' efforts to secure their own study sites. This was during the Dust Bowl, and as Roosevelt's New Deal was reforming federal land management, and ecologists were, as a new discipline, the Ecological Society of America was founded in 1915. Right? They were kind of vying with foresters who were part of a more established discipline for influence on federal policy. So they were looking to establish study sites, again, kind of circling back to my early interest in study sites, looking to create study sites that were distinct from wilderness protection areas and were distinct from game reservations. And the work of these early scientists, which included women ecologists like Edith Roberts and Eloise Butler here, who's collecting specimens in a bog outside of Minneapolis, people who have been overlooked in the history of ecology. Their work kind of informed both the design of ecological gardens and naturalistic gardens and landscape architecture. They also influenced Aldo Leopold's famous restoration project at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which was unveiled in 1935. And a lot of histories, the histories of restoration that do exist kind of argue that Aldo Leopold kind of single-handedly created restoration, and that this University of Wisconsin-Madison site was the first restoration site globally. And so I'm kind of writing against that and saying that there were earlier restoration sites, many of which run by female ecologists. So in part 2, I analyze how the atomic age transformed ecological theory and restoration practice. So after World War II, when the US began detonating dozens of atomic weapons at the colonized Marshall Islands, ecologists used radioisotopes from detonations to follow the circulation of elements among organisms. This was a new way of visualizing connections between species, and it birthed the discipline of ecosystem ecology. So in Wild by Design, I traced the shift over the 20th century from efforts to restore individual species to efforts to restore entire ecosystems. And I'll circle back to nuclear weapons in a moment, but just to give you a quick sense of what the rest of the book does. Part 3 analyzes how post-1970s federal environmental laws gave rise to the practice of killing non-native species, so invasion biology, as well as the emergence of a new scientific discipline, restoration ecology, which has its own conferences, its own journals, its own professional society. So this is the period, and this is where I get into the weeds about my nerdy bureaucratic interests about the structure of different federal agencies. But this is the period during which restorationists embraced a pre-colonial baseline for restoration and started setting up projects trying to recreate pre-1492 ecological communities. In doing so, naturalizing Native American land management and kind of implicitly or accidentally absolving contemporary people in politics of blame for ongoing ecological damage. It's also a time when land managers around the world began to shift from a hands-off preservation model to a hands-on restoration model. In the 1990s, restoration was consolidated, it was privatized. Consolidation was made possible by the innovation of off-site mitigation. And this is the practice of compensating for ecological harm at one site with ecological care at a separate, unrelated site. And this is something that we're used to today with carbon offsetting, but I argue that it was not an obvious thing to do. Up until this point, up until the 1990s, restoration happened at the site of ecological damage. So I look at the Disney Wilderness Preserve as an early example of a large off-site mitigation project. This was a project that was brokered in 1989 when Walt Disney World was looking to expand its parks and was required under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act to compensate for the wetlands that were going to be paved over. So in a novel arrangement that was brokered by the Nature Conservancy, Disney funded a massive restoration project about 20 miles south of Disney. This was one of the first off-site mitigation projects in the world. And I argue that off-site mitigation is so historically important because it uncouples sites of harm from sites of care. And in doing so, it paved the way procedurally and also conceptually for today's carbon offsetting market. Consequently, off-site mitigation the idea of it has actually redistributed ecosystems, both within the United States and around the world. And it's reconfigured relations between the global north and the global south, fashioning the latter as a source of wild nature that's meant to compensate for ongoing pollution and environmental degradation in the global north. And I end the book, as I mentioned, by thinking about how climate change is increasingly pushing restoration ecologists toward interventionist management like assisted migration and assisted evolution. And over the past century, restorationists have shifted from the expectation that nature can essentially recover on its own to the recognition that environmental management is going to require ongoing and never-ending active management. So I argue that as governments and corporations begin to invest billions of dollars in restoration, that we need to use the history of restoration to ensure that the costs, risks, and benefits of restoration projects are equitably distributed. In order not to continue to repeat the injustices of the past, we need restoration approaches at a local scale and to empower impacted communities at every step of the restoration project, from planning through monitoring. So to go back to bombs, strikingly, the idea that that intervention in the wild might always be necessary didn't come from kind of a recognition of deforestation or climate change or other kind of global environmental changes. It emerged from World War III planning, very specifically. So between 1946 and 1958, the United States detonated the equivalent of 70,000 Hiroshima bombs in the Marshall Islands. Refugees from Bikini and Rongelap still cannot return to their homes. In 1950, the federal government also established the Nevada Proving Grounds on Shoshone and Paiute lands, and subsequently detonated 100 atmospheric and 921 underground nuclear weapons there. These tests released approximately 12 billion curies of radiation, causing decades of cancer and death. Ecologists were among the many scientists that the federal government conscripted to study the effects of these detonations. And although it's little remembered today, the US Atomic Energy Commission was actually the main funder of ecology between the 1940s until the mid-1970s, when the National Science Foundation was established in 1970, and by kind of the mid-1970s was funding ecological research. So as the United States and the Soviet Union massively increased both the power and the range of their nuclear weaponry, it became possible to imagine a catastrophic global scale war. In 1950, the United States had 299 nuclear weapons in its stockpile. By 1965, it had 31,139. So along with military planners and sociologists and even science fiction writers, the US government tasked ecologists with imagining a world shaped by the immense destructive power of nuclear weapons. In doing so, ecologists didn't imagine the total annihilation of life on Earth, because then they wouldn't have a project to do, right? There would be no point to such an exercise. Instead, they imagined how the government could promote biotic recovery after World War III, how they could pursue ecological restoration. So my research reveals how doomsday experiments kind of birthed the discipline of disturbance ecology, and this is the discipline, the study of how perturbations or stressors shape the components and the character of ecosystems. Government investment in doomsday ecology began in earnest in 1961 when, in a classified report, the Rand Corporation urged the Pentagon to start investigating post-war recovery of biotic environments. Soon thereafter, the Atomic Energy Commission began to fund studies in which ecologists purposefully damaged ecosystems rather than warships or model towns to understand what happened, if they recovered afterwards, and if so, how. And then with the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which banned above-ground detonations, ecologists began simulating nuclear attack. And so began a series of experiments that concretized the idea that ecosystems were things that humans could damage or even destroy. So the first ecological doomsday simulations happened at the Brookhaven National Laboratory on Long Island. In 1962, ecologists exposed a former agricultural field and an oak pine forest to continuous gamma radiation for 5 months. There's the radioactive deer that roam on Long Island today are just one legacy of these experiments. Ecologists, through this atomic field work, kind of developed the idea that certain species are better able to survive stressors than other species. And again, this is an idea that's familiar to us today. If we think about, like, there's drought-resistant species or climate change resilient species. Like, this idea of resilience is very central to environmental management today, but it emerges from these experiments looking to see, like, oh, the pine species in this study did not survive, but the species in the daisy family did survive. This was a new way of thinking about species. Instead of by taxonomy or by what ate what, it was thinking about species and ability to withstand disturbance as a way of categorizing species. And by 1970, following the RAND Corporation's recommendation that studies of comparative radiosensitivity be enormously increased, ecologists had placed radiation sources in deciduous forests at Brookhaven, in tropical rainforests in Puerto Rico, in a desert in Nevada, and in agricultural fields in Georgia and Tennessee. As destruction became a kind of standard method of studying ecosystems, ecologists also began clear-cutting study sites, burning field sites, and applying biocides to field sites. And the kind of best known example of this from island biogeographical theory is E.O. Wilson and Dan Simberloff's experiments in the 1960s, where they fumigated entire islands in the Florida Bay to see how species recolonize these islands. And it's kind of not remembered the military, or this was funded by DARPA. There was a military purpose to these experiments as well as a theoretical one. So Doomsday ecology, I argue in the book, also entrenched the diversity stability hypothesis. And this is the basis of most contemporary environmental management. And this is the idea that ecosystems containing more species vary less in response to a disturbance than ecosystems containing fewer species, whether that disturbance is climate change or nuclear war. So by the 1980s, ecologists had come to see diversity as a key measure of ecosystem health. These now familiar theories were assembled on a bedrock of destruction. Ecologists laid waste to forests, dispersed poisons, all to challenge the view that nature could heal itself. So to switch to my current project for a few minutes, and I think you'll see the through lines with bombs, with military, with biocides. While with Wild by Design, I was attempting to understand one of many potential solutions to the biodiversity crisis. With my current project, I'm seeking to understand an unappreciated driver of the biodiversity crisis, and that's herbicides. So I'm conducting archival work now for this project. And I'm going to spend a few minutes kind of outlining the stakes and main arguments before we open up for questions. So herbicides are the most recent of biocides, chemical compounds that are explicitly designed to and manufactured to destroy biodiversity. When Rachel Carson published Silent Spring in 1962 and alerted the global public to the harms of biocides, herbicide use in the United States was just beginning to eclipse insecticide use. Today, herbicide use globally and within the United States greatly exceeds insecticide use. So in this chart, we can see that between 1990 and 2020, the amount of this is only in an agricultural context, but the amount of herbicides used in agricultural systems in the United States has increased rather noticeably, whereas insecticides used has remained relatively stable. And rodenticides, which you can't really see in this graph, it's in the dark blue, has actually decreased. The usage has decreased in agricultural areas. Despite this chart, herbicides are relatively understudied by environmental studies scholars compared to insecticides. Few people overall study biocides at all, despite the fact that we are living in a current rapid proliferation of the number, diversity, and toxicity of biocides and other synthetic chemicals. There was a paper that just came out last year that I think is really interesting that argued that, or showed that in the past 40 years, the rate of increase in synthetic chemical production has actually outpaced other well-known drivers of biodiversity loss, including atmospheric carbon dioxide emissions, including nutrient pollution, including habitat destruction. So bridging environmental history and my evolutionary ecology roots, I'm currently working on a global history of the herbicide 2,4-D. 2,4-D was there's a few reasons I'm studying 2,4-D. It was the world's first synthetic herbicide, and it remains, it's now number 2. It was the world's most used herbicide in the world, and now it's second to glyphosate. This chemical is both literally and figuratively invisible. It applies clear, so it is literally invisible, but it's also a compound that few people have heard of. I had not, recognized what it was prior to starting this research myself. And I'm interested in identifying the reasons that it is so difficult to see and how the chemical industry has managed to shield 2,4-D and biocides more generally from regulatory scrutiny. Like climate change, this invisible compound has remade entire societies and ecosystems. And the world-shaping power of 2,4-D stems from the fact that it's a selective herbicide. So it kills dicots, it kills broadleaved plants like poison ivy, like maple trees, but it does not impact monocots, narrow-leaved plants like grasses, like bananas. So this makes it an incredibly powerful agricultural tool. Many staple crops are grass species, corn, wheat, sugar. In the war against weeds, I want to argue that the global proliferation of 2,4-D and related compounds explains how agricultural, but also residential and conservation landscapes have become grasscapes. Grasscapes like this one, the Phragmites australis monoculture that I began my career working in. Since its synthesis in the 1940s, 2,4-D has been used not only for agriculture, but also for home lawns, dandelion, many people in this room. I've used it on poison ivy, I have to admit, even though I'm studying this and critical of it. I do use it on poison ivy because I don't want to touch poison ivy. It is used in, and I also did not imagine myself going into the history of sports, but it is used in golf one of the first marketing places that 2,4-D was marketed was in golf, country clubs and golf associations. It's used in sports turf management. It's used in utilities, right-of-ways. It's used to clear the US-Mexico border. It's used in conservation management. It's used by land managers to try and get rid of particular invasive species. And it's used as a weapon of war. So 2,4-D is one of the 2 compounds that make up Agent Orange. So my research is following 2,4-D from laboratories in Britain, Canada, and the United States, where it was first synthesized, to test grounds in Kenya and India, to battlefields in Vietnam, disposal sites in the Pacific Ocean, and American backyards. Surprisingly, my research suggests that 2,4-D's immense power to reshape life at a global scale is a historical accident. Researchers weren't aiming to develop a selective herbicide when they first developed 2,4-D. They were looking for the opposite. They were trying to develop plant growth hormone. They're plant growth enhancers. 2,4-D is a growth hormone mimic. So synthetic auxins like 2,4-D were first created in laboratories by researchers looking to grow bigger and stronger crops. And the they realized that applied in large quantities, this compound actually worked as an herbicide. This might have not been a big area of research if not for World War II. So a desire to develop synthetic herbicides arose during World War II, driven by the US and British militaries and by chemical companies' interests kind of converging at that time. So the Inter-Service Chemical Warfare Committee in London and Washington was looking for new methods to kill enemy crops from the air, at the same time that the chemical industry was looking to develop new products to synthesize from fossil fuel byproducts. Like many biocides, 2,4-D is synthesized from fossil fuel byproducts that would otherwise be waste. And this is a photograph of one of the first experiments showing that 2,4-D is a selective herbicide, probably the first experiment. So we see on the top left sugar beets that are untreated compared to the top right of sugar beets that are treated with 2,4-Ds 10 days after exposure. So the sugar beets do not survive. This made it look like a good weapon, potentially. On the bottom left, you see wheat, which is a grass species, untreated, and then on the bottom right, wheat that is treated with 2,4-D 10 days after exposure. So it was clear to scientists that this was going to be an important and profitable agricultural tool once they realized this that it was a selective herbicide. So American farmers first heard about 2,4-D in 1945 when Dow Chemical, Sherwin-Williams, American Chemical Paint Company, and DuPont began to sell it for agricultural use, describing it as a solution to wartime labor shortages. The growth of the 2,4-D market depended upon petrochemical companies convincing consumers that weeds were a problem. Interestingly, I think at a time that the federal government had just been coming off of the Dust Bowl, convincing farmers that they needed to protect and plant broadleaved plants. So there's an interesting thing to think about there. Early advertisements for 2,4-D portray hand pulling and hoeing as outdated technologies that are going to be replaced by chemical tools. They render grass a raced and gendered species. Many advertisements like this one linked hand pulling to black labor and implied or overtly told white consumers that chemical tools would liberate them from these associations. A 1945 article in Time, The War Against Weeds, announces that because of 2,4-D and the insecticide DDT, U.S. farmers and gardeners are better armed than ever before for this year's, this is a quote, U.S. farmers and gardeners are better armed than ever before for this year's battles against their prime enemies, insects and weeds. In addition to targeting growers of corn, wheat, sugarcane, companies focused their initial trials and marketing campaigns on homeowners and lawns. This is a 1946 ad that's titled Doomsday to the Dandelion. Let's get rid of weeds now that chemistry has developed an easy economical method for their destruction. And throughout, I've gone through kind of Dow's PR archives, and throughout their material, they describe 2,4-D and their early product lines as Dow's chemical arsenal. So as we know, chemical companies succeeded in selling farmers and homeowners and environmental managers on the need to kill broadleaved plants. In 1952, only 10% of US corn acres were treated with herbicides. By 1976, 90% of US corn acres were treated with herbicides. Other crops globally have followed the exact same trend. So I'm planning to argue that since its market debut in 1946, 2,4-D has played an underappreciated and pivotal role in shaping the ecology of agricultural, residential, and forested landscapes from the equator to the Arctic. Widespread and long-term use of 2,4-D has transformed diverse ecosystems into what I call grasscapes. These grasscapes are considerably less biodiverse than the habitats that they replaced. And the effects of 2,4-D do not end with the targeted plants. 2,4-D also persists in the environment. 2,4-D is so the mechanisms through which 2,4-D kills plants are not understood. Its degradation products are not understood. There's no research basically into the persistence of its degradation products in the environment. There's kind of really interesting and understudied questions on the plant physiology and biochemistry side. It's likely that 2,4-D, the few studies that do exist suggest that 2,4-D is everywhere. So a study that came out 2 years ago found that more than 40% of water samples taken at the Great Barrier Reef contain 2,4-D. And studies, if the studies that exist are correct, 1 in 3 people in this room have high levels of 2,4-D in their urine. 2,4-D and other herbicides are also acting as a selective force to change plant species themselves. So not only are they altering the course of ecological history, they're also altering the course of evolutionary history. Herbicides, ecologists have documented how herbicides are reducing foraging opportunities for pollinators and thereby are decreasing population sizes of pollinators. But this in turn is having an impact on the evolution of flowering plants. So a study that came out a few weeks ago found that in only 20 generations, self-pollination among field pansies in France has increased 27%. So as I continue to research the development and dissemination of the world's oldest herbicide, I'm thinking about the agency of 2,4-D as a material that reshapes ecological relationships and socioeconomic relationships. Because I haven't even talked about it here, but 2,4-D also, and other herbicides also radically change farming practices from everything from like how far apart crops are placed to what is planted. 2,4-D is an excellent case study for the chemical Anthropocene, our time that's marked not only by fossil fuel consumption, but also by the synthesis of novel carbon-containing compounds at a massive scale. Plastics being just one of them, or biocides being another. 2,4-D is used in extraordinary quantities around the world, but it's understudied, it's invisible. It's a material that's determining which species live and which species die in almost every environment. It's altering the course of evolution. With oxenic herbicides, petrochemical companies and consumers have created a world of grass. And in doing so, we've transformed life on Earth, not just for humans, but for the 8.7 million other species that we share the world with. So overall, my kind of research is kind of thinking about how policies like the Dawes Act of 1887, ideas like the ecosystem concept, or the myth of pristine wilderness, and materials themselves like 2,4-D or atomic bombs are reshaping life on Earth. And I hope I have you thinking today about how the science of biodiversity loss cannot be understood apart from the politics and history of biodiversity loss, and by extension, that it's futile to pursue technical solutions to environmental problems that are severed from political and historical context. So I'll stop there and open up for, I think we have a little bit of time for questions, and then there's a reception as well. Thank you.
So you're willing to entertain questions?
Yes, I don't know if we should do that at food or.
Oh, no, I think we have time. May I ask a question?
Yep.
What's the commercial name for 2,4-D?
It doesn't have a well-known commercial name.
But if I'm an Alvashon.
It's going to say like weed killer.
Oh.
It's going to be the unbranded. There's a whole, also I did not go into it, but there's a very, and I am not a legal historian, so I'm not going to go too far into it, but there's a really interesting, there's a project for someone about patent history. So 2,4-D was patented as a plant growth enhancer in 1945. Its use as an herbicide was not patented. So as soon as companies realized that it was a selective herbicide, they all start producing it. It's made out of phenol, so very easy to, a byproduct of fossil fuel refining that's very easy to and cheap to synthesize. It's a very cheap thing to synthesize. So every petrochemical company starts selling it in 1946. And then the patent holders sue, but they're not successful because it's not the specified use under the patent. But you'll see it at the hardware store just as like, it'll just be like plant killer. They don't, there's not one brand name because it's not owned by one company.
One thing that I never understood with the idea of like the Disney Park and Nature Conservancy is this idea of like, so we took away a wetland and we built this wetland in the other place. But we didn't build the wetland in the other place where a parking lot was before. We built the wetland in another place where there was another, and I just don't understand that. Does it not make as much sense as I think it doesn't make? It doesn't.
The reasons, so conservationists that collaborated with industry on the regulations under the Clean Water Act that mostly fall under the jurisdiction of the Army Corps, but also under the EPA and the very confusing memorandum of agreement. Conservationists that were in support of offsite mitigation, well, first off, industry was in support of it because it made it easier to do development. Instead of having to hire someone and pay for them to build a wetland on site, they could just give money to an entity like the Nature Conservancy and be done with it. So it was good. Developers saw it as a clear win. The reason that conservation biologists largely supported it, there's now many conservation biologists who don't support it for the reasons that you say, and there's been a lot of ecological studies that show that mitigation wetlands do not replace the functions of destroyed wetlands. They don't contain the same species. You can imagine the wetland that was destroyed with the Epcot expansion is not the same a totally different ecosystem type than the one that was restored 20 miles south. But conservation biologists supported it because of research at the time that suggested that larger patches were better habitat for species. And so instead of having 1,000, like the little wetlands that were being created around Walmarts were not good habitat. They weren't attracting, they were kind of just like grass filled, again, going back to the grass thing, but they were grass filled pits that like they were maybe functioning as for water retention, but they weren't biodiverse. So conservationists they wanted to funnel resources toward bigger projects that were more likely to be monitored and lead to successful habitat creation. So it was not a particular, offsite mitigation was not a particularly controversial practice when it was first proposed. It gets proposed through like very obscure working groups and white papers. Like it's not actually, offsite mitigation emerges from regulatory practice. It's not actually codified in this confusing way that took me a long time to get a handle on. But on both the conservationist side and the developer side seemed like a win-win kind of scenario. Digu.
So thanks, wonderful. I know this isn't the subject of what you were talking about, but are there lessons or distinctions or contrasts that can be made with the more notorious, maybe DDT history? I mean, I know that you showed the graph amazingly that this other thing is that what you've been talking about has been just steadily growing in a stealth kind of way, in a sense, right? But I was interested in is the story of DDT have like some kind of a basis of comparison that would be useful?
Yeah, it certainly does, and I think it might be the counterexample. So DDT is a kind of the case study in environmental studies for a biocide that both public figures like Rachel Carson as well as scientists working behind the scene were able to demonstrate to lawmakers that it had a clear impact, unintended impact on wildlife, including the thinning of eggshells. DDT was banned in the United States, although its international export was not banned. And there's been a recovery of a number of species, including bald eagles that were impacted by DDT. DDT closely related, there's a historian of chemistry, Evan Hepler-Smith, that has a great article about this. DDT, the compound itself, is banned, but closely related compounds are not banned because of chemical nomenclature and the way that the EPA regulates chemicals. So this particular historian of chemistry argues for there needs to be an entire rethinking of the of how the EPA classifies chemicals. So even if you were to ban something like 2,4-D, there's many closely related compounds that would not be banned. So I think there's a thing to think about there. And I think 2,4-D is one of many biocides that has not had the public knowledge of its effects in the way that DDT has. And I think it's particularly interesting because, and I didn't go into this, but 2,4-D is one of two components of Agent Orange. So chemical companies are able, during protests in the 1970s and 1980s against the use of Agent Orange, they're able to successfully shield 2,4-D from public scrutiny in a way that they were not able to shield the other component of Agent Orange, 2,4,5-T, from scrutiny. So 2,4,5-T, so dioxin which is a potent carcinogen, is produced when you synthesize 2,4,5-T. And scientists were able to kind of expose that, and 2,4,5-T gets banned, but not 2,4-D, which is very closely related. And so I think but I do in the project, I'm going to be diving into the history of DDT. DDT synthesis also has its history in World War I and World War II, and the kind of development of chemical weapons for use against people. So there's a lot of parallels there as well. Sarah?
So I'm so excited about these projects. What are the reasons that 2,4-D has been researched so much less? I mean, the public doesn't know about it, but scientists certainly know about it, and you would think there would be interest. What is it? It's not suppressed in some way, right? It's suppressed in the sense that the one chemical company's PR files that I've looked through so far is Dow. But the Dow PR office very intentionally separates separates 2,4-D from Agent Orange and 2,4,5-T. So there is a kind of intentional PR campaign around 2,4-D, but I think it's just the overwhelming number and diversity of biocides that exist. And there aren't that many people that study biocides. There was a paper that came out that showed that in the Division of Biological Research in the NSF, only 2% of proposals mentioned synthetic chemicals. And not all of those were funded, right? So it's just not an area where there's a lot of biologists working. I think the kind of exception is that pollinator ecologists are really starting to focus on insecticides and there was a paper that came out in Science last week that was just put bee colonies in agricultural fields in Europe and listed all of the different insecticides that were found in the honey and beeswax after being out for a few weeks. And I emailed the authors, and they did also look at herbicides in the supplemental material, which I'm excited about. So hundreds and hundreds of compounds that these bees are encountering when they forage. So I think there's just, there's an infinity of questions, not just for environmental historians to ask, but also biologists, also agricultural scientists.
Artie? Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming in. Sorry. Okay, so you talked about the federal government and its various agencies. Dorothy, you mentioned, was kind of a key player, perhaps the key player, for developing not only ecological theories like the disturbance hypothesis, but the chemicals themselves. Oftentimes for wartime uses, etc. Okay, so there's the federal government kind of role that was very Cold War, I think, inspired. But then you also mentioned glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Monsanto's flagship pesticide or herbicide, and then DuPont, another giant evil company, and so it seems like now it's kind of like these big companies rather than the government and there's not necessarily such a strong delineation between the two, but that is controlling, that's kind of the analogous actor, right, in today's kind of space. And so, am I right to kind of attribute a shift in terms of a government, i.e. public, to a corporate, i.e. private, sort of, and I guess I'll just start there.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, yes, with an asterisk. If we're thinking, so we're thinking about different things. Like, if we're thinking about who funds ecological research, like it used to be the federal government through the Atomic Energy Commission. It's largely still the federal government through the National Science Foundation. So we're talking about like basic research. We're thinking about the development of biocides. I do think that in some way it was always university researchers and private researchers and chemical companies doing the work, and then the federal government supporting it through grants or through kind of directly contracting in World War II under secrecy, kind of contracting experiments. That continues through the Vietnam War. But then after that, I think it was largely private corporations. So with glyphosate as an example, Roundup as an example, with Monsanto, you could certainly make an argument that like USDA support and subsidy plays a role in that, but you could argue that that's more of a company-driven development. I think that glyphosate is entangled in this story too, because glyphosate as a broad spectrum herbicide is kind of developed because 2,4-D stops being as effective because of like evolved resistance, and so there's a piece in there too. But yeah, just want to check on time. Maybe are we good on time? Should we?
All right, so maybe we should close questions now, and everybody can go upstairs and have cookies. And you can pepper Laura with questions on fascinating topics that she's introduced today. It's making my hair stand up on end. So Laura Martin, thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you.